Greetings. Let us talk about how to handle accessories. This is one of the basic functions an endoscopy assistant performs, and I must say that you should take pride in handling biopsy forceps. If you do that well, you will be able to do several other functions that involve a similar mechanism. So before we go there, you need to do a couple more things. As you set up your room for endoscopy procedure, you should look at your biopsy jars or specimen jars and take time to label them so that you're ready whenever you take a specimen during the procedure. So that's one thing, label your jars. The next thing is check your inventory inside the room. Make sure that you have adequate supply of different items that you will be using during the procedure, and not only the first procedure, for also the remaining procedures during the day, so that you don't have to run out in the middle of the procedure to grab an instrument. So, label your jars and check your inventory inside the room. And if you don't have enough, go to the main storage area, get your supplies before you start your cases. Another important function is to observe closely what is happening and anticipate what is needed so that you could be helping your endoscopist and having a good control on all the things that you're supposed to do. So here the endoscopist sees a lesion and you also see that, and you know that endoscopist will ask for a biopsy forceps, and before he asks for that, you should be able to go find your biopsy forceps packet, take it out and be ready. Say for example, you are assisting another nurse or another first assistant, and when they ask for a biopsy forceps, you remove the biopsy forceps from the packet, unwind the loops, close the biopsy forceps and hand over in this fashion. This is the best way to hand over the biopsy forceps or any other instrument that comes in a loop, and so that the first assistant doesn't have to worry about untangling the loops. That could frustrate the endoscopist if he has already pushed the biopsy forceps down the channel and then you're trying to untangle things. I also said that you should hand over the biopsy forceps in a closed position. What do I mean by that? When you put your finger into the thumb ring and forefinger and middle finger on the groove and close your grip, the forceps remains closed. Whenever you give the biopsy forceps to the endoscopist, make sure you give that biopsy forceps in a closed position. This is especially important if the biopsy forceps has spikes, and if you hand over in an open position, the spike could damage or puncture the endoscopist, and it can result in unnecessary issues. So this is something important to keep in mind. So when the endoscopist is ready to receive the biopsy forceps, he removes his right hand from the scope and lifts it up in a slightly closed grip, and you deliver the closed biopsy forceps in between the thumb and forefinger, where he quickly grasps and then inserts down the biopsy channel. To make it easy for the endoscopist, push the biopsy forceps down the channel with a minimum number of strokes. You should create a nice loop like an arc so that he can push it down with long strokes. If you don't have that arc, he will be struggling because he can only make small movements. Keeping that arc is critical and in helping the endoscopist push the forceps down in a few pushes down the channel. Once the biopsy forceps comes out of the field, there are basically two things that the endoscopist will say. He will say, open the forceps. That means you open your hand and the forceps opens up. And then when he pushes to the lesion, and he will say close. That means you close your grip and the biopsy forceps closes. And once he is happy, he will pull the forceps out from the field into the channel, and then some endoscopists try to pull the sheet on their own, or they may ask you to pull the sheet out, and in which case there are a couple of tricks. If you stand slightly away from the endoscopist and maintain some distance, you will be able to pull the forceps out of the biopsy channel in a few strokes. If you are very close, you may end up requiring multiple strokes to pull it out. Another important thing, you want to avoid spills from the biopsy channel, and in order to do that, keep a little bit of gauze in your left hand or right hand close to the biopsy cap so as to avoid any spills. Once the biopsy forceps comes out, you have two jobs to do. One job is to let the endoscopist know the specimen size. You should say loudly, big specimen or small specimen. You could also say good specimen or a good piece or a small piece. Don't say a bad piece. So a good piece or a big piece or a small piece. So this helps the endoscopist figure out how many more biopsies he should take. If the specimens are small, he may end up taking more specimens so that he could establish the diagnosis. So it's critical for you to say loudly, big piece, small piece. The next thing is, you should also inform the nurse in terms of the container that is going to receive the specimen. So here is the first biopsy that we have taken. It goes into jar A. You should say stomach biopsy jar A. And the nurse will say stomach biopsy jar A, and then she enters into the computer. This way you would avoid any confusion and you would avoid mistakes. Mistakes can happen where somebody doesn't hear you clearly and they may enter that into a different entry in the computer, So especially when you're taking multiple biopsies, the entry may be wrong. So you want to avoid that confusion by saying loudly, good specimen, stomach biopsy, jar A. After you've done that, you want to clean the biopsy forceps tip in water, because this specimen jar has formalin. You don't want to give it back to the doctor with the formalin on your biopsy tip. So clean it up, dry it up, and then hand over, and then go through the same steps that we talked about. After the procedure is done, it is your responsibility and the responsibility of the nurse to check all the specimens, make sure that you have a specimen in each jar and the jars are labeled properly. The reason I say this is important is sometimes you may be putting the specimen in the wrong jar, or you may be putting the specimen in the correct jar, but the nurse may be entering in the computer wrong. So you want to avoid all these mistakes by taking time to go over the specimens, and everybody is on board with this process. Thank you.